Let me tell you something about the Yoruba that most political analysis, including the Sultan of Sokoto's institutional positioning on this question, appears to have fundamentally misread. The Yoruba are not simply a people who happen to be divided between Islam and Christianity. They are a civilization, one of the oldest, most intellectually sophisticated, most institutionally complex civilizations on the African continent. A civilization that absorbed Islam in the 17th century, absorbed Christianity in the 19th century, fought a series of devastating civil wars across the same period, survived British colonialism, produced the most educated professional class in sub-Saharan Africa, and emerged from all of it with a civic identity so deeply layered and so distinctly its own that it has consistently proven resistant to being reshaped by external institutional frameworks, regardless of how powerful those frameworks are, and regardless of which direction they come from. The Sokoto Caliphate's tradition, the British colonial administrative system, the military government's centralizing agenda, all of them encountered the Yoruba civic identity and found that it bent without breaking, absorbed elements it could use, resisted elements that threatened its core, and remained recognizably itself on the other side. Political Sharia, as institutionalized in the 12 northern states since 1999, is the latest external institutional framework to arrive at that civilization's boundary. And the 7 structural realities I am about to lay out explain why it will find, as every previous framework has found, that the Yoruba identity is not territory that can be governed by a system that did not grow from inside it. This is not an anti-Islam argument. Yorubaland has been home to sophisticated Islamic scholarship since the 17th century. The Muslims of Ibadan, Lagos, Ijebu, and Ilorin are not newcomers to their faith. They are inheritors of a distinct Islamic tradition that predates the Sokoto Caliphate's influence in their region, and that has its own jurisprudential lineage, its own scholarly institutions, and its own understanding of how Islamic governance relates to Yoruba civic life. What will not work in Yorubaland is not Islam. What will not work is the specific political institutional model that has been built in the 12 northern states. The model of governance through religious enforcement, parallel legal systems, Hizbah police forces, and Sharia commissions accountable only to their appointing governors. That model did not work for the northern populations it was built to serve. It has even less foundation in a civilization that has never organized its civic life along those lines and has no institutional tradition that would make such organization legible, legitimate, or sustainable. Here are the 7 reasons: structural, historical, demographic, economic, institutional, political, and jurisprudential. Why? If you are new here, subscribe before we go further. This channel exists to deliver the analysis mainstream Nigerian media won't touch. It gets deeper from here. Reason 1. The Yoruba civic identity predates and outranks religious identity as an organizing principle. This is the foundational fact that any serious analysis of this question must start with, and that the framing of a Muslim push into the Southwest consistently ignores. In the 12 northern Sharia states, religious identity functions as the primary organizing principle of civic life. A person in Zamfara is a Muslim first, a Zamfara citizen second, and a Nigerian third. That ordering is not accidental, and it is not superficial. It is embedded in Yoruba cosmology, in the institution of the Oba, in the Egungun masquerade tradition, in the Ifa divination system, in the Ogboni society, in the entire architecture of Yoruba spiritual and civic life that predates both Islam and Christianity by centuries, and that both religions entered without displacing. This means something specific and structurally important for the Sharia question. A governance system that places religious identity above civic identity as its organizing principle is not entering neutral territory in Yorubaland. It is entering a civilization that has already resolved over centuries the question of how religious identity relates to civic identity and resolved it in a way that subordinates religious identity to the broader Yoruba civic framework rather than the other way round. You cannot implement a governance system built on the primacy of religious identity in a civilization that has built its entire institutional life on a different answer to that foundational question. The mismatch is not political, it is civilizational. The Sultan's institutional tradition, the Sokoto Caliphate, resolved that same foundational question in the opposite direction in 1804. Danfodio's jihad established that Islamic identity was the primary organizing principle of governance in the territory the caliphate controlled. That resolution has governed northern Nigerian political culture for 2 centuries. It is a coherent tradition within its own historical context. It is simply not the Yoruba tradition, and the gap between the two is not bridgeable by any amount of political negotiation or religious advocacy because it is not a political or religious disagreement. It is a civilizational difference in the foundational architecture of how a people organize their collective life. Reason 2. Yorubaland's Muslim-Christian coexistence is a structural feature, not a political arrangement. The Muslim-Christian coexistence of Yorubaland is not a product of political tolerance, constitutional rights, or interreligious dialogue programs. It is a structural feature of Yoruba family and community life that has been operating for generations without needing any of those external supports. Consider what this coexistence actually looks like at the ground level. In the same Yoruba family, the same household, the same compound, it is common for siblings to be divided between Islam and Christianity. Muslim parents with Christian children, Christian parents with Muslim children, brothers who celebrate Eid and brothers who celebrate Christmas sitting at the same table, attending each other's ceremonies, contributing to each other's bride prices and naming ceremonies and burials. The religious difference exists. It simply does not organize the family's primary loyalty or the community's primary civic relationships. This is not a recent development born of modern Nigerian constitutional values. It predates Nigerian constitution. It predates Nigerian independence. It predates British colonialism. It is a feature of how Islam and Christianity entered Yorubaland, not as competing civilizational systems that demanded exclusive loyalty, but as additions to a pre-existing Yoruba cosmological framework that was already complex, already pluralistic, and already capable of accommodating multiple spiritual orientations without requiring any one of them to dominate. Now, consider what political Sharia requires as a precondition. It requires that Muslim identity function as a civic boundary, that the Muslim population of a territory be governed by a distinct legal and enforcement system that marks them as institutionally separate from their non-Muslim neighbors. The Hizbah enforces Islamic conduct standards in public spaces. The Sharia courts adjudicate disputes between Muslims under a different legal code. The Sharia commissions regulate Muslim civic life through a parallel governance structure. None of that is implementable in a social environment where the Muslim-Christian boundary does not function as a civic boundary. In Yorubaland, that boundary runs through families, through friendships, through business partnerships, through the same compounds. A Muslim officer enforcing Islamic conduct standards in Ibadan market would be confronting a social environment in which the Muslim trader and the Christian trader have been doing business together, sharing the same space and operating under the same informal social rules for generations. The institutional separation that political Sharia requires does not map onto a social reality that has never been institutionally separated. This is not a problem that can be solved by political will or religious advocacy. It is a structural incompatibility between a governance model and the social architecture it would have to govern. Reason 3. Yoruba Islamic scholarship has its own jurisprudential tradition that predates and is independent of the Sokoto framework. This is the dimension of this story that is most consistently missed, and it is the one that makes the Sultan's institutional claim on southwestern Nigerian Muslim communities most analytically problematic. Islam arrived in Yorubaland through multiple routes and over several centuries. Through the trans-Saharan trade networks that brought Muslim merchants from North Africa and the Sahel into Yoruba commercial centers as early as the 14th century. Through the influence of the Mali and Songhai empires, whose scholarly networks extended into Yorubaland. Through the direct migration of Muslim scholars from further north who established themselves in Yoruba cities and built educational institutions there. By the time Usman Dan Fodio launched his jihad in Hausaland in 1804 and established the Sokoto Caliphate, there was already a sophisticated and well-established Islamic scholarly tradition in Yorubaland, particularly in Ilorin, which was then a Yoruba city before it became the southernmost emirate of the Caliphate following a military conquest in the 1820s that remains a contested historical wound in Yoruba collective memory. The Islamic scholarly tradition of Yorubaland developed within the Maliki school of jurisprudence, as did the Sokoto tradition, but with its own chains of transmission, its own institutional centers, its own scholarly lineages, and its own understanding of how Maliki jurisprudence applies to the specific social and cultural context of Yoruba life. The scholars of the Central Mosque of Lagos, of the Ansaruddin Society, of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community's Nigerian branch, which has deep Yoruba roots, of the Muslim Student Society, which was founded in Lagos, these are not branches of the Sokoto scholarly tradition. They are an independent tradition with their own institutional history and their own jurisprudential positions. This matters for the Sharia question in a very specific way. The Sultan of Sokoto is the President General of the Nigerian Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs. That title gives him a national institutional role in representing Nigerian Muslim interests. What it does not give him is jurisprudential authority over Yoruba Muslim communities whose scholarly tradition does not derive from the Sokoto lineage and has never recognized the Sultan as their primary jurisprudential authority. When the Sultan makes institutional claims about what Islamic governance should look like for southwestern Nigerian Muslims, he is making those claims over a community with its own scholarly tradition, its own institutional history, and its own jurisprudential answers to the questions he's raising. The most credible challenge to his position on Sharia courts in the southwest is not a Christian one. It is an Islamic jurisprudential one, coming from Yoruba Muslim scholars who can say with equal authority and greater historical relevance to their community that the institutional model being proposed does not represent their tradition and is not supported by their jurisprudential lineage. Reason 4. The Yoruba economy is structurally incompatible with the governance disruptions political Sharia produces. The 12 northern Sharia states are, economically, predominantly agrarian and pastoralist, with urban commercial centers in Kano and Kaduna that represent the most economically developed parts of those states. The formal private sector is thin. The informal economy is large. Federal allocations, FAC transfers, constitute the overwhelming majority of state government revenue in most of the 12 states. The economic structure is one in which the state is the primary economic actor and the population is largely dependent on it. Yorubaland's economic structure is fundamentally different. Lagos State alone generates more internally generated revenue than the 12 Sharia states combined. The Southwest has the most developed private sector in Nigeria, the highest concentration of professional and entrepreneurial class, and the most integrated position in the Nigerian and global formal economy.
The Yoruba business community in manufacturing, finance, trade, media, technology, and professional services operates within a framework of commercial law, contract enforcement, and business regulation that is integrated with national and international commercial law. Political Sharia, as implemented in the 12 northern states, creates specific governance disruptions that this economic structure cannot absorb. The parallel legal system creates commercial law uncertainty, which contracts are enforceable in which courts, under which legal standard, with which evidentiary rules. The Hisbah enforcement in commercial spaces creates regulatory predictability for businesses operating in mixed religious environments. The restriction on certain categories of financial products, interest-bearing instruments, certain insurance products under Sharia-compliant financial frameworks creates friction with the conventional financial system that Yoruba business is fully embedded in. These disruptions are manageable, though damaging, in an economy where the state is the primary economic actor and federal allocations buffer governance failures. They are not manageable in an economy where the private sector is the primary driver of growth and where investment decisions are sensitive to regulatory predictability, commercial law certainty, and governance quality. Lagos is Nigeria's commercial capital and one of Africa's most significant economic centers precisely because it has maintained, imperfectly and with many failures, but consistently, a governance environment in which commercial activity can be planned, contracts can be enforced, and business disputes can be resolved through a legal system integrated with national and international commercial law. Introducing a parallel legal system into that environment does not simply add an option for Muslim residents. It creates the kind of legal and regulatory uncertainty that investment capital, domestic and foreign, moves away from. The economic argument against political Sharia in Yorubaland is not ideological, it is structural. The governance model is not compatible with the economic architecture it would have to operate within.
Reason 5. The history of Ilorin means the Yoruba have specific and unhealed institutional memory of what Sokoto authority over Yoruba territory produces. This is the historical dimension that is almost never raised in mainstream coverage of this confrontation, and it is the one that gives the Southwest's resistance an emotional and historical depth that pure political or constitutional analysis cannot fully capture. Ilorin today is the capital of Kwara State. It sits at the geographic boundary between the Yoruba Southwest and the Hausa Fulani North. It has a large Yoruba-speaking population. Its traditional ruler, the Emir of Ilorin, is a Fulani Emir, appointed through the emirate system of the Sokoto Caliphate, whose authority derives from the Caliphate's conquest of what was then a Yoruba city in the 1820s. The story of how Ilorin became an emirate rather than a Yoruba city-state is one of the most contested historical wounds in Yoruba collective memory. Afonja, the Yoruba Are Onakakanfo, the military generalissimo of Oyo, invited Alimi, a Fulani Islamic cleric, to assist him in his rebellion against the Oyo Empire in the early 19th century. Alimi's son, Abdul Salam, subsequently displaced Afonja's successors and established Ilorin as an emirate under Sokoto authority. The Yoruba who remained in Ilorin were incorporated into a political and legal system organized around Fulani Emirate authority and Islamic governance, a system that, from the Yoruba perspective, was imposed through military conquest rather than adopted through consent. The Oyo Empire attempted to retake Ilorin. It failed. The failure contributed to the collapse of the Oyo Empire and the series of Yoruba civil wars that defined the 19th century, the Ijaye War, the Ekiti Parapo, the conflicts that eventually brought British intervention and colonialism. The Yoruba did not forget this. The institutional memory of Ilorin, of what happened when Sokoto authority was extended over a Yoruba city, has remained a live element of Yoruba political consciousness for 2 centuries.
When the Sultan of Sokoto today makes institutional claims about Islamic governance in the southwestern Nigeria, he is speaking into a Yoruba political consciousness that has a 200-year-old case study of what those claims look like when they are given institutional expression in Yoruba territory. That case study does not produce confidence. This does not mean the Sultan's contemporary position is equivalent to the 19th century conquest of Ilorin. It is not. The contexts are incomparably different. But institutional memory does not operate on the precision of historical analogy. It operates on the emotional and political residue of historical experience. And the emotional residue of Ilorin in Yoruba political consciousness is a residue of loss, of a Yoruba city incorporated into a political system that was not Yoruba, not by consent, and not reversibly. The Sultan of Sokoto's push for Sharia courts in the southwest arrives into that historical memory, and the Yoruba political response to it is shaped, whether anyone says so explicitly or not, by that 200-year-old wound.
Reason 6. Yorubaland's political culture is built on consensus, accountability, and the institutional constraint of power, the opposite of what political Sharia requires. The traditional Yoruba political system, centered at the Oba and the council structures that surrounded and constrained him, was not a system of absolute monarchy. It was a system of structured accountability. The Oba held enormous symbolic and ceremonial authority, but his political power was constrained by the Oyo Mesi, the Council of Kingmakers, whose authority included in the Oyo Empire system the power to instruct an Oba to open the calabash, to commit ritual suicide if his governance became unacceptable. The Ogboni society provided another layer of accountability, monitoring the conduct of power and intervening when it exceeded its legitimate boundaries. This is a political tradition in which power is always accompanied by institutional constraint. The ruler is answerable not to God alone as in the framework of divine right governance, but to institutional structures with the authority and the mechanisms to remove him. Political Sharia, as implemented in Nigeria, reverses this relationship. The governor who implements Sharia wraps his political authority in divine sanction, making himself answerable to God rather than to institutional constraint. Any challenge to his authority becomes a challenge to divine law. The accountability mechanisms that democracy is supposed to provide are disabled by the same religious framing that gives the system its popular legitimacy. This is not compatible with the Yoruba political tradition. Not because the Yorubas are more democratic than other Nigerians, they are not, and their own political history contains plenty of autocracy and abuse of power, but because the specific mechanism through which political Sharia disables accountability, the claim that governance authority derives from divine law rather than from institutional mandate, runs directly against the foundational architecture of Yoruba political thought, which has always understood power as requiring institutional constraint from below rather than divine authorization from above. The Yoruba political class, whatever its many failures, understands that its authority is institutionally derived and institutionally constrained. A governance model that claims authority from a source that cannot be institutionally challenged is not constitutionally problematic in the Southwest, it is culturally illegible.
Reason 7. The demographic reality of Yorubaland makes the institutional separation that Sharia requires ungovernable. The final reason is the most practically concrete, and it is the one that any administrator who examined this question seriously for 5 minutes would arrive at. Political Sharia, as implemented in the 12 northern states, requires, as a functional precondition, a Muslim majority population concentrated enough that a parallel Islamic governance system can operate as the primary governance framework for a meaningful territory. Even in the 12 Sharia states, this requirement produces the Hizbah inequality I documented in earlier investigations. States where the Muslim population is concentrated and the governance system can achieve the critical mass to function, however badly, and states where the system exists only on paper because the population distribution makes it operationally meaningless. Now, apply this to Yorubaland. The Muslim population of the Southwest is significant, estimated between 40 and 50% of the total population in states like Oyo, Osun, and Ogun, with lower proportions in Lagos, Ondo, and Ekiti. But this Muslim population is not geographically concentrated. It is distributed across communities where Muslim and Christian households are interspersed at the street, compound, and family level. There is no southwestern Yoruba city, no southwestern Yoruba local government area, no southwestern Yoruba community of any significant size where the population is Muslim majority in a way that would allow a Sharia governance system to operate as the primary governance framework for that territory without simultaneously governing or attempting to govern the non-Muslim population living within it. This is not a theoretical problem, it is an operational one. A Hizbah force operating in Ibako does not patrol a Muslim neighborhood. It patrols streets where Muslim and Christian households are neighbors, where Muslim and Christian traders share the same market, where Muslim and Christian families attend each other's ceremonies. The enforcement of Islamic conduct standards in that environment does not regulate a Muslim population. It regulates a mixed population, and it does so without the constitutional authority to apply to the non-Muslim members of that population. The demographic distribution of Yorubaland makes the institutional separation that Sharia requires not just politically controversial, but operationally impossible. You cannot build a parallel governance system for a population that is not separable from the population it would have to coexist with. The attempt to do so does not produce Islamic governance, it produces communal conflict.
Now, let me address the counter-arguments that will come, because this analysis will attract them and they deserve serious engagement. The strongest counter-argument, the Sultan and those who support the Sharia court push are not proposing the 12-state model for the Southwest. They are proposing Sharia personal law courts, civil jurisdiction, marriage, divorce, inheritance, which the Constitution already provides for. This is a much more limited proposal than the analysis above addresses. This is a genuine distinction and must be acknowledged. Sharia personal law courts for civil matters are constitutionally provided for and are operationally different from the full Sharia criminal jurisdiction of the 12 northern states. The 7 reasons above address the full political Sharia model, and they apply in full to any attempt to replicate that model in Yorubaland. They apply in modified forms to the more limited civil courts proposal, primarily through reasons 2, 3, and 7, the social structure incompatibility, the jurisprudential independence of Yoruba Islamic scholarship, and the demographic distribution that makes even civil jurisdiction separation operationally complex. The response to this counter-argument is the one that Yoruba political leadership has failed to make clearly enough. Make the distinction explicit. Say precisely what is being resisted and why. Civil Islamic courts for personal matters administered by Yoruba Islamic scholars within the Yoruba Islamic jurisprudential tradition, that is a conversation that Yoruba Muslims have the right to have on their own terms. The importation of the 12-state institutional model, the Sharia commissions, the Hizbah, the criminal jurisdiction, the parallel governance architecture is what the 7 structural realities above make ungovernable in Yorubaland. The failure to make that distinction publicly and precisely is the biggest strategic error the Southwest political leadership has made in this confrontation. It allows the Sultan's position to be framed as a moderate constitutional proposal being met with an unreasonable blanket rejection. Precision dismantles that framing. The 3 biggest misconceptions. The first, the Southwest resistance is anti-Islam. 7 reasons, not one of which is anti-Islam. 3 of the 7, the Yoruba Islamic jurisprudential tradition, the Muslim-Christian coexistence structure, and the demographic distribution are entirely internal to the Muslim community's own interest and are arguments that Yoruba Muslims themselves are making. The resistance is anti-political Sharia, not anti-Islam. That distinction must be stated loudly and repeatedly. The second, Yoruba Muslims have no say in this. Their Christian neighbors are making the decision for them. The evidence runs in the opposite direction.
The most sophisticated and institutionally grounded resistance to Sharia court expansion in the Southwest is coming from within the Yoruba Muslim scholarly community, from scholars and institutions that understand their own jurisprudential tradition well enough to know that the model being proposed does not represent it and has no claim to authority over their communities. The third, these 7 reasons are temporary obstacles that political will and religious advocacy can overcome. They are not temporary obstacles. They are structural features of Yoruba civilization, Yoruba demography, Yoruba economics, and Yoruba political culture that have been built over centuries and that have proven resistant to reshaping by far more powerful external forces than any contemporary religious or political movement. The British tried to reshape Yoruba political culture for 60 years. The military tried for 30. Both left Yorubaland recognizably itself. Sharia political will find the same resistance, not because Yoruba people are uniquely stubborn, but because civilizations with deep institutional roots do not reorganize themselves around externally imposed frameworks that are incompatible with those roots. Drop a comment right now. Before the strategic outlook, which of these 7 reasons do you think is the single most powerful argument against Sharia taking hold in Yorubaland? Tell me below.
The reform dimension of this story is important precisely because the 7 reasons above are not arguments for doing nothing. They are arguments for doing the right thing, which is allowing Yoruba Muslim communities to develop their own Islamic institutional framework within their own cultural and jurisprudential tradition, rather than importing a model from a tradition that is not theirs. The Ansaruddin Society, founded in Lagos in 1923, represents the kind of Yoruba Islamic institution that this process would build on. It combined Islamic education with Western education, producing Muslim professionals who were fully embedded in both their faith and the modern economy, precisely because it understood that the Yoruba Islamic tradition could absorb and integrate modernity without abandoning its Islamic character. That is the institutional model that has worked in the Southwest. It is the one that any serious Islamic governance discussion in Yorubaland should start from. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community's deep roots in Yorubaland represent another dimension, a form of Islamic practice that has been fully integrated into Yoruba civic life for over a century, that runs schools, hospitals, and community services, and that has done so without requiring any institutional separation from the non-Muslim communities it serves alongside. These are the indigenous institutional models. They are not foreign impositions. They grew from inside the Yoruba Islamic tradition, and they point towards what Islamic civic contribution in Yorubaland actually looks like when it is allowed to develop from its own roots rather than being asked to reorganize itself around an imported framework. Where does this go from here? The most likely outcome of the Sultan's push in the current political environment is managed retreat. The proposal is diffused through diplomatic language. The 2027 electoral pressure makes open confrontation too costly for every actor. And the institutional question is shelved without resolution. Both sides claim the outcome as a victory. The underlying structural realities remain exactly as the 7 reasons above describe. Watch for any attempt by outside Islamic institutions, Saudi-linked bodies, foreign Islamic NGOs, to build a presence in southwestern Nigeria that would begin to shift the institutional landscape in ways that make a future Sharia push more viable. The long-term strategy, if there is one, does not run through political declarations. It runs through institutional presence. The same playbook that built the 12 northern states' Sharia infrastructure over 2 decades before 1999. The 5-year trajectory, if nothing changes, the 7 structural realities remain intact. The Southwest continues to be the most functional model of Muslim-Christian coexistence in sub-Saharan Africa. Yoruba Islamic scholarship continues developing within its own tradition. The Sultan's institutional authority in the Southwest continues to be the ceremonial kind rather than the governance kind.
And the 1999 constitutional wound continues to sit unaddressed, available for the next political actor who decides to press on it. The 5-year trajectory: if the institutional push intensifies, the Southwest is forced to articulate the precise constitutional and jurisprudential arguments that this investigation has laid out, and in doing so, forces the national constitutional conversation that every administration since 1999 has avoided. That conversation is the one Nigeria needs to have. It is also the one that would be most destructive if it is forced in a climate of political polarization rather than constitutional deliberation.
Here is the answer to the question this investigation opened with. The Sultan of Sokoto does not lack knowledge of the Yoruba. He is an educated, institutionally sophisticated man who understands Nigerian political geography. What the 7 reasons above suggest is not an intelligence failure on his part. It is an institutional assumption. The assumption that the Sokoto authority over Nigerian Muslim affairs is a national authority, applicable across regions, cultures, and jurisprudential traditions. That assumption is the product of the Sokoto Caliphate's own historical experience, a tradition in which Islamic authority and civic authority were unified under a single institutional framework, and in which that framework's claim to govern was precisely its claim to represent authentic Islam for everyone within its reach. The Yoruba's answer to that assumption, the 7 structural reasons above, is not a rejection of the Sultan's personal authority or his genuine concern for Nigerian Muslim welfare. It is a statement about what kind of country Nigeria is. A federation of distinct civilizations, each with its own institutional history, each with its own resolution of the foundational questions about how religious identity relates to civic identity, each with its own tradition of Islamic practice that belongs to it and not to anyone else's institutional framework. The Sultan knows the Yoruba. What the 7 reasons suggest is that the institutional tradition he represents has not yet fully reckoned with what knowing the Yoruba actually means for the reach of its authority. That reckoning, conducted through jurisprudential dialogue, through constitutional clarity, through the recognition of Yoruba Islamic scholarship as an equal and independent tradition, is the conversation that could produce something genuinely valuable for Nigerian Muslims across all regions. The institutional push that bypasses that reckoning will find, as every external framework before it has, that Yorubaland is not territory that reorganizes itself around a system that did not grow from inside it. Here is my question for the comments. Of the 7 reasons I laid out, the civilizational identity hierarchy, the Muslim-Christian coexistence structure, the independent jurisprudential tradition, the economic incompatibility, the Ilori historical memory, the accountability political culture, and the demographic distribution. Which one do you think is the single most decisive argument? And here is the harder question. Is there an 8th reason I missed? Drop it below. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.